Would you risk your life for someone who hates you? Would you risk your life for someone who hates you? The plane was in flames, its body twisting and groaning as it fought against the fire that consumed it. Smoke filled the sky, thick and choking, as the wreckage cracked and crumbled under the intense heat. It was chaos, panic. Every second counted. 12-year-old Malik Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he ran through the inferno, his legs and arms covered in cuts and bruises from the debris he had been forced to navigate. His breath came in ragged gasps, the icy air burning his lungs with each breath he took. His vision blurred with the smoke, but he forced himself to stay focused. Time was running out. Behind him, Victoria Lancaster, the billionaire's wife, stumbled over the wreckage, limping and struggling to keep up. Her high heels, now destroyed, only slowed her down. She was panicking, her face pale with fear. The same woman who had insulted him just hours before, the one who looked down on him because of where he came from, was now the one depending on him for her survival. "You have to move, lady. We don't have time," Malik shouted over the roar of the flames that licked at the fuselage. His voice cracked with urgency as he turned to look at her, adrenaline surging through his veins. He didn't know how much longer they had before the wreckage collapsed entirely. The fire was growing, faster than he could have imagined. There was no time for hesitation. Victoria glared at him, her pride fighting against the fear that was overtaking her. She didn't want to accept his help. She didn't trust him, not after everything that had happened. He was just a janitor's son, someone beneath her in every way, in her eyes. He wasn't supposed to be the one to save her. But as the fire closed in, and she struggled to move, her panic grew stronger than her disdain. "I can't," she gasped, looking at him with wide eyes. "You!" Before she could finish her protest, Malik was already there, his arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her up. She stumbled, her body unsteady, but Malik wasn't about to let her fall. He couldn't afford to waste time arguing. Malik's heart raced as he lifted her, ignoring the burning pain in his legs, his body screaming for him to stop. He didn't have the luxury of stopping. He had to get them both to safety, even if it meant carrying someone who had looked at him like he was nothing just hours before. The irony wasn't lost on him. This was the same woman who had humiliated him, the same woman who had thrown insults his way because of the life he had to live. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Victoria Lancaster was a human being, and she needed his help. She didn't have a choice now. The weight of her body in his arms felt heavier with every step. But Malik gritted his teeth and kept moving, his gaze locked on the path ahead. The fire was close now, too close, and he knew that if he didn't get her out of the wreckage soon, they would both be dead. Victoria's breath was shallow, her body trembling with the strain of trying to keep up. She said nothing as Malik carried her, her pride completely swallowed by the very real fear of death. She had no choice but to rely on the boy she had once looked down on. And Malik, despite everything, didn't hesitate. What would you do if the only person who could save you was the one you looked down on? Would you swallow your pride and accept their help, or would you let fear and hatred cloud your judgment? Malik didn't have time to think about that. He just ran, faster than he ever thought possible, driven by the need to survive, to save her, because for all her faults, she was still a person in need. The flames were closing in, but Malik was faster. And, in the end, the only thing that mattered was whether they made it out alive. What would you do if the only person who could save you was the one you looked down on? As the story unfolds, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it, and what kind of stories you read. Let us know in the comments. Malik had never known luxury. Victoria had never known struggle. Malik grew up in foster homes, moving from one place to another, never staying in one spot long enough to call it home. He had learned early on that survival wasn't a given. It was a daily challenge. He was used to being invisible, to slipping through the cracks unnoticed by people who didn't care. He worked any job he could get, cleaning floors, washing dishes, carrying luggage, anything that would make a few dollars to keep him going. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was the only life he knew. Victoria, on the other hand, had been born into privilege. She had never had to worry about where her next meal would come from, or whether she could afford clothes for school. Expensive clothes, private jets, and five-star treatment were a normal part of her life. Her world was filled with luxury, things that Malik could barely dream of. While he struggled to find a place to fit in, Victoria was surrounded by everything she could ever want, treated like royalty wherever she went. Their lives couldn't have been more different. Two worlds so far apart that they might as well have been in different universes. The only time their paths crossed? On the flight. Malik was working as a flight assistant, doing his best to keep everything running smoothly for the passengers. His uniform was neatly pressed, but it didn't matter to him. It was just another job, another step to keep going. As he made his way down the aisle, handing out towels to passengers, he came face to face with Victoria. She was sitting in first class, of course, surrounded by luxury and comfort, a far cry from the cramped seats Malik had gotten used to. She looked up at him, her eyes scanning him for a moment before rolling them in blatant disdain. "They're letting just anyone work on these flights now," she muttered, loud enough for Malik to hear. "Disgraceful." The words stung, but Malik didn't let them show. He had heard it all before. People like Victoria always looked through him as if he didn't matter. He wasn't important enough to even warrant a second thought in their minds. But in that moment, as he handed her the towel with a polite smile, he said nothing. What was the point? She wouldn't care. Nothing he said would change how she saw him. So he kept his head down and moved on, just like he always did. He had long stopped expecting anything different from people like her. In his world, people like Victoria were untouchable. They lived in a reality where money could solve everything, where power and privilege shielded them from the world outside. Meanwhile, Malik lived in a world where survival depended on staying unnoticed, on not causing any trouble, on keeping his head low enough to avoid getting caught in the crossfire of a system that didn't care about him. But life has a way of flipping things upside down, of showing people that no matter how much money or power they have, some things cannot be bought. In a few hours, nothing from Victoria's world of privilege would matter. The plane would crash, flames would fill the sky, and she would be left with nothing but her life in the hands of someone she had once looked down on. And Malik? The boy who had always been invisible, the boy who had learned to survive on his own, would become the only person capable of saving her. The irony wasn't lost on him. In that moment, he would have all the power, and Victoria, the woman who had once humiliated him, would have no choice but to rely on him for survival. Life had a strange way of making sure that, sometimes, the tables turned when you least expected it. What would you do if you were Malik, in a situation where someone who once looked down on you now needed your help? Let us know in the comments. The flight was smooth until it wasn't. Malik was moving down the aisle, refilling drinks for the passengers, when the first jolt shook the plane. It was sudden, a sharp bump that caused several passengers to gasp in alarm. The drinks rattled in his hand, and for a moment he thought it might have just been turbulence. But then the lights flickered, and everything changed. A deep sense of unease settled over the cabin as the plane seemed to shudder under the pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, trying to reassure the passengers. But there was a nervous edge to his tone that betrayed the severity of the situation. Malik's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. Before he could take another step, there was a deafening boom. The entire plane lurched violently, sending passengers flying forward in their seats. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments with a sharp snap. The cabin was filled with the sound of screams, gasps, and the roar of metal tearing under immense pressure. Malik was thrown off balance and slammed hard against the floor. His breath was knocked out of him, and for a moment, everything went black. But there was no time to think. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as the world around him seemed to tilt and sway. The panic in the cabin was palpable as people shouted, trying to make sense of the chaos. The turbulence was unlike anything Malik had ever experienced. It felt like the plane was plummeting. Victoria Lancaster, sitting in first class, had her hands tightly gripping the armrests, her face drained of color. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. She looked like a person who had never known fear, someone who had always been insulated from the world's harshness by her wealth and privilege. But now, in the face of this nightmare, she was no different from anyone else. Her money meant nothing here. The wealth that had once protected her from the world's problems could not save her from the one thing she couldn't control: her survival. Malik could see her in the chaos, struggling to pull the oxygen mask over her face. She looked at him, her panic evident. But for the first time, there was something else in her eyes. A recognition, a realization that sent a chill down his spine. She needed him, and there was no one else to help. He didn't think twice. As the plane rattled and groaned around him, Malik's focus narrowed to one thing: getting her out of danger. This wasn't about the insults, the humiliation, or the way she had treated him. This was about survival. He had learned to survive against the odds his whole life. And now, it was his turn to make sure she did too. He made his way toward her through the chaos, stepping over debris and dodging the panicked passengers. His legs burned with the effort, but he didn't stop. As he reached her seat, he saw her trying to unbuckle her seatbelt, her hands trembling. Malik grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet, his heart pounding in his chest. Survival wasn't guaranteed. It had to be fought for. The impact was brutal. The force of the crash sent the plane skidding across the frozen ground, the wheels of the fuselage scraping against the ice and snow, sparks flying. The sound of metal tearing apart filled the air as flames erupted, rising into the dark sky, casting a fiery glow on the wreckage. Malik's body slammed against the seat in front of him, the force knocking him out cold for a moment. When he finally came to, chaos was everywhere. The smell of smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The heat from the fire scorched the wreckage as screams echoed in the distance. Malik's head was spinning, but his survival instincts kicked in. He pushed himself up, shaking off the disorientation as the world around him continued to break apart. Metal was twisted beyond recognition, parts of the plane scattered across the icy wasteland like a twisted puzzle. The sound of crackling flames and moaning metal was deafening, but he ignored it all. And then he heard it. "Help! Someone help me!" It was a voice, high-pitched, desperate. Malik's eyes darted around, and his breath caught when he saw her. Victoria Lancaster, the billionaire's wife, was trapped. A large metal beam had fallen on top of her, pinning her down. She was struggling, her body twitching under the weight, her face twisted in fear. For a moment, Malik hesitated, the heat of the fire pressing closer as he watched her fight to free herself. She had treated him like he was nothing. She had mocked him, dismissed him, and looked down on him. He had no reason to help her. She didn't deserve his compassion. But then he saw her, really saw her in that moment. Her panic, her helplessness. She was human, just like anyone else. The fire raged around them, and Malik knew that if he didn't act quickly, they'd both be trapped in the inferno. He could have walked away. He could have left her to deal with her fate, to suffer just like she had made him suffer. But something deep inside him refused to leave her behind. "Hold still, lady. I got you." Malik grunted, his voice hoarse from the smoke as he ran toward her. He could barely breathe, his lungs burning from the smoke, but the urgency in her voice pushed him forward. He dropped to the ground, his muscles straining as he assessed the weight of the beam on her. His hands were trembling, but he gritted his teeth and set his jaw. He wasn't going to leave her to die. Not today. With all his strength, Malik lifted the beam, his body shaking under the pressure. His hands burned, his back screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The fire was getting closer, and the screams from the wreckage were growing louder. Victoria's face was pale, her eyes wide in shock, as she watched him struggle to free her. For the first time, she wasn't the woman who had looked down on him. She was just another person, someone who needed help. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Her voice was hoarse, raw from the smoke and the strain of the crash. She couldn't understand it. After everything, why was he helping her? Why wasn't he leaving her to fend for herself, just like she had left him to fend for himself all these years? Malik didn't answer. There was no need to explain. There was no time to explain. He just grabbed her hand and pulled her to safety, his legs weak, but his resolve stronger than ever. His hands slipped from hers as he helped her stand, and together they stumbled away from the wreckage. In that moment, the woman who had once seen him as worthless now owed him her life. Malik didn't know what the future held for either of them, but one thing was certain. He had done what no one expected. He had done the impossible. He had saved her. What would you have done if you were in Malik's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Some debts aren't paid with money. Some are paid with something greater. Hours passed. The cold air bit at the survivors, and the fire that had once raged in the wreckage was now just smoldering ashes. The rescue teams had finally arrived, their lights flashing in the distance, cutting through the dark, snowy expanse. Medics moved quickly, attending to the injured, their faces grim with the weight of their work. Victoria lay on a stretcher, her body sore, her hands still trembling from the shock. Her head spun as she looked around, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The world was still chaotic, but one thing was clear. She was alive because of Malik. Malik sat nearby, wrapped in a thin, worn blanket. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and soot from the crash. He didn't look like a hero. He didn't look like a savior. His small frame was hunched over, his eyes distant, his body shivering from the cold, but the exhaustion in his eyes told a different story. He wasn't just physically drained, he was emotionally spent. The fire, the wreckage, the weight of carrying someone who had once dismissed him, it had all left its mark. Victoria watched him from the stretcher. She had never truly seen him before, not really. Before the crash, he had been nothing more than the flight assistant, a background figure in her life, someone who was there to serve, but not worthy of her attention. In her world, people like Malik were invisible. They were beneath her, and that was how she had always seen them. But now, as she watched him sit there, alone in the cold, she realized that everything she thought she knew was wrong. Malik wasn't just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, someone to be looked down upon. He wasn't just a flight attendant or some invisible worker. He was someone who had made a choice, who had put his life on the line to save hers. Her heart tightened as she realized the weight of that truth. He had saved her. Not because it was his job, not because he had to, but because he saw someone in need. In the moment when her life hung in the balance, when she had no one else to turn to, Malik had been there. He had ignored everything, her insults, her arrogance, her dismissive behavior, and had done what no one else could. He had acted when it mattered most. Victoria's throat tightened as she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "That boy saved me." The words felt strange in her mouth, as if she were speaking about a completely different person. It was a life-changing realization that settled deep within her. She had always judged him, always placed him into a category that made her feel superior. Yet he was the one who had saved her life. Not her wealth, not her status, not her beauty or influence. In that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was Malik's courage, his strength, and the humanity he had shown when the world had turned its back on him. And for the first time in her life, Victoria wanted to do something about it. She wanted to make it right. She wanted to undo the harm she had caused, the way she had treated him, and others like him. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to start by seeing people for who they really were, not by their wealth or status, but by their actions, their character. Malik had shown her that. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had spent her life focusing on the wrong things, the superficial markers of success. Now, she saw Malik for who he truly was, a person of incredible strength and worth, someone who had given everything to help a stranger. And she would make sure the world saw him the same way. As the rescue team moved around them, Victoria's gaze lingered on Malik. Her heart, once filled with prideful superiority, was now filled with something else: respect. Deep, genuine respect for someone who had changed her life forever. What do you think of Victoria's realization? Have you ever had a moment that changed the way you see the world? Let us know in the comments. Months later, Malik adjusted the suit jacket awkwardly. The fabric felt foreign against his skin, stiff and heavy, with an elegance he had never experienced. He wasn't used to wearing expensive clothes. But as he looked across the table, at the woman who had once looked down on him, he realized how far his life had come in such a short time. Victoria Lancaster sat across from him, smiling warmly, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. The same woman who had once insulted him, who had made him feel small and invisible, now looked at him with something entirely different: respect. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice steady but sincere. She slid a folder across the table, her fingers brushing the edge of it as she did. Malik's eyes locked on the folder. It was thick, important. He looked up at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "And now, I want to change yours." Malik felt his heart stop for a second. His breath caught in his throat as he stared down at the folder, uncertainty rising in his chest. His mind raced with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he opened it. Inside, legal adoption papers. He blinked, trying to process the words in front of him, as if they were written in a language he didn't understand. He ran his fingers over the papers, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked up at Victoria, his voice barely a whisper, struggling to find the right words. "You're adopting me?" he whispered, disbelief making his voice falter. Victoria nodded, her expression softening as she met his gaze. The smile on her lips was no longer the smug, superior one he had once seen. It was real, genuine, and filled with something deeper, something that transcended the past. "You showed me what real strength looks like," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You saved me when you had every reason not to. You didn't hesitate, even when I treated you like you didn't matter. I want to give you the future you deserve." Malik's world shifted in that moment. The boy who had been treated like nothing, the one who had been overlooked and disregarded, now had everything. Not because of luck, not because of money, but because of his heart, the courage he had shown when it mattered most. Tears welled in his eyes as he held the papers in his hands, the weight of it all sinking in. He had never expected this kind of life, never dreamed it would be possible. Just months ago, he had been a young boy struggling to survive, invisible to the world. And now he was sitting here in a suit, with a woman who had once thought nothing of him offering him the future he had always longed for. Victoria had seen something in him that he hadn't even seen in himself. She had seen his strength, his kindness, and his ability to rise above the hurt he had been dealt. And she was giving him everything she could offer in return. Malik swallowed hard, the emotions flooding him. He couldn't find the words to express what he was feeling, but his heart spoke louder than anything he could say. For the first time in his life, he felt seen. He felt valued. And it was all because of one moment, a moment when he chose to act, when he chose to save someone despite everything. The future that lay before him was uncertain, but it was his to shape. And he wasn't alone. He had a family now. He had a future. Would you have saved Victoria? Comment below, like and share if you believe in second chances.